Purity Culture, High Control Religion, and Autistic Masking. Hi, I'm Brett the Audio Boss, and on this channel we talk about ADHD and autism in the workplace. I'm Brett. I have a late diagnosis of autism and ADHD, and I have over 12 years leadership training and experience. But today, we're kind of throwing most of that out the window. Instead, I'm going to spend a little time getting vulnerable and doing a little bit of unmasking in my conversation today with author and educator Erica Smith. We're going to talk about the intersection between autistic masking, rigid rules, and specifically purity culture. Author and educator Erica Smith has a new book out called The Purity Culture Recovery Guide. More on that in just a moment. I was born into a fundamentalist evangelical church. My earliest memories of this time are rooted in the rules that the church governed for how many of us were supposed to be and how we were supposed to exist in the world. But those rules and those values were for the church. While I left that world in my teenage years, I carried with me a tremendous amount of shame. And I carried with me a lot of rigid rules and values that I didn't know if they were mine or if they were values that were baked into me at an early age. It wasn't until I started to understand my identity and to start to accept myself, and through the process of unmasking, that I could start to question what my values were and who I was and what I needed and what I wanted in life. Discovering I was both queer and late diagnosed autistic and ADHD helped me to question all of those values and begin to better unmask and find my way into what I truly wanted and what I truly needed in life. And just a quick reminder, the concept of masking is an unconscious way of hiding our likes, our desires, what we want and what we like and what we dislike. Oftentimes when we're masked, we're performing without even knowing for other people, for what their needs are, for what their wants are, and not for ourselves. Early on in that unmasking journey, I began to follow the work of author and educator Erica Smith. In addition to being the author of the Purity Culture Recovery Guide, sex educator Erica Smith is also the founder of the Purity Culture Dropout Program, which offers comprehensive and inclusive and trauma-informed sex education that many of us never receive. She draws on more than 2 decades of professional experience and replaces shame with empathy, self-compassion, and empowerment. The subtitle of the book is The Shame-Free Sex Education You Deserve. She provides medically accurate information about our bodies, birth control, pleasure, communication, consent, alongside with affirming discussions of gender, sexuality, and relationships. I started out our conversation by asking Erica to define for us what purity culture means.
I like to think of it in terms of specific and broader. So in a broader sense, it is a very rigid system of control around gender and sexuality that you can find in other religions other than Christianity. Like it's in fundamentalist versions of all the major world religions. When we think of purity culture, especially in the context of my work, it refers to that phenomenon in the United States becoming a big movement, which was pushed on youth in the early 1990s through, I mean, it hasn't died, honestly. It had a heyday, but we're seeing it in new forms. Purity culture, as a lot of people think about it in America, is related to like evangelicals, Southern Baptists, and folks who began campaigning for young people to think about waiting until marriage to have sex, to pledge their virginity, which I put in quotes, and to turn it into like a politicized movement for young people. And then an industry sprung up. So there's the rings, there's books, there's Passport to Purity, all of those things too.
So that was going to be my next question is, why did it take such hold in the 90s and the early 2000s? Was it the, products? Was that it?
Oh, I love that you asked this question. I just got done doing a talk for other sex educators about Christian nationalism and purity culture and its effect on sex ed in America. And there is an answer to the, why did it kind of gain traction in the early 1990s? And it was because of the Southern Baptist Convention. They created the True Love Waits campaign and movement. And in, I believe it was 93 or 94, they had an event on the lawn in the National Mall in DC where they had purity pledge cards, like thousands and thousands of them. And they like they turned it into not just a personal decision for a young person, but something that was carrying the weight of the nation's morals.
Yeah.
And, it was framed as you can help guide America in the right direction with your vow of purity. Fantastic researcher who studies and writes about that is Dr. Sarah Mosliner. And her book that honestly just came out in November or December is called Pure White. And she explains how the purity movements in America are associated with like racial purity and upholding white women as the, the moral arbiter of everything in America.
So I was born 1980, born into a fundamentalist Christian group. I refer to it as a cult, but I think the people who were there would not like that, but I don't care. So for me, a lot of like reading through your book, there were certain moments where it felt both deeply familiar, but also a little triggering because it's like, I am out of that life now. I have, I want to ask you about deconstruction in a second, but if it's someone like me who, I followed your work for years, but even so, jumping into this book, there's just these moments where it's just like, I don't know, I get this feeling that comes over me, where it's just like, I got to keep doing this work. I want to do this work. It's important to me because I want to grow through it. But like, how do I set myself up to read the book if I'm somebody who's, hearing this conversation, everything, who's experienced all of this? How should I be approaching your book in terms of like bringing that luggage that I have?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I would say maybe the beginning parts where I'm explaining purity culture don't need to be read by folks. I did the explaining of it for several reasons, but one is because there are folks who come to my work because they want to help others. So a lot of like therapists and social workers who might be like, I don't really even know what purity culture is. Let me actually get a sense of how deep this is. And I also included that stuff in the first part of the book, because if there are people who wonder, maybe it actually wasn't that bad and I'm making a big deal out of nothing. I want them to know that, no, you weren't. But, looking at I have my own copy here as well. It's very fun to get to refer to my own book.
I love that.
I would say, chapter 1 is the truth about purity culture. Chapter 2 is confronting purity culture values. If you know that you may be triggered by sort of diving into that information, skip right to the chapters where you are curious.
Yeah.
Because the rest of the book is like, the names of the chapters are like bodies, pleasure, fantasy, masturbation, what is sex, sexual healthcare. Like, if you know everything about purity culture and you know that reading that part is going to be difficult, go for the stuff that you actually have questions about. That would be my recommendation.
Well, and that's what I love about the book so much and we'll get back into certain topics, but it truly is a guide, and it's written so accessibly, without judgment, without shame, which is a critical point of the entire book, shame-free. But just sort of like, there's so many great entry points for where I can just open up a page, understand something that maybe I only knew a little bit about before, or maybe I was embarrassed to ask about before. And then it's just like, it's just right there in such an accessible way. How did you set off? How did you know what to include versus not to include? Because it doesn't feel like too much. It feels very accessible.
Oh, that's so nice to hear, Brett, because as the author, my biggest struggle as an educator is that I want to tell people everything. I want you to know everything that I know. And so when I wrote the first draft, it was way longer than it needed to be. And so cutting it down, it was painful for me. It was like, I want to include all of this stuff. But I really tried to focus on, in the years I've been working with people who came out of purity culture, what are the things that I know people ask me the most? What comes up again and again? And also, like, what are things that I have heard outright lies about?
Yeah.
And what are the things that I hear that people have the most anxiety about? And I tried to keep it focused on those things. And I do include, a pretty good like resource list at the end for more learning, because I recognize that a sex education book that's like 250 pages isn't going to teach everything that everyone wants.
Yeah.
So, that's how I try to distill it.
I want to come back to something you just said about the lies, in particular of purity culture, and in particular, the many, many, many myths that many of us who were born into this were raised with, and how, as an adult today, it's still complicated to unpack what's a myth that I thought to be true, raised in that, versus, things that are obviously, not. So how did you approach, there's so many. How did you approach all the myths and the lies? Because there's such a great deal of them.
Yeah. That was actually something I talked about with my editors. Like, do we have a special chapter or section that's just like, here is a common myth about sex, and here's the, science-based statements about that. Instead of doing that, I just tried to work it into the chapter that it fit with.
Yeah.
So, for example, like myths about abortion are in the abortion chapter. Myths about STIs are in that chapter. Myths about masturbation are in that chapter. So, yeah, I kept copious notes. In the time I've been working with clients in this way, I just have a lot of things documented. And so when I really stopped and went back through all of my writing to be like, what are some of the myths that people hear over and over? And some of them I don't think are surprising, but then other ones are like so specifically evangelical purity culture that I'm like, I'd never heard that in my life until I started working with people. And an example would be like that you can damage your future sexual relationship with your spouse if you engage in like masturbation or fantasy.
Which is absurd.
Yes.
Just the creativity of where these things come from is always shocking to me.
It is. When it comes down to it, I feel like purity culture as it's taught in order to control the behavior of people in America is injecting fear into every single facet of human sexuality in ways that it would never even occur to me to do.
So much of that fear gets so ingrained in us that, especially at such a young age, where you're trying to learn the ways of the world, you're trying to understand how to exist as a human being, and then you've got messages from your parents and your church and everything. When you get to be an older adult and you're kind of coming out of that, what is the long-term damage of that message at such a young age as you're growing up?
Yeah. It's hard to untangle that damage from some of the general religious trauma. And I actually just did a podcast, the Strong-Willed podcast with Crispin Mayfield. And he was asking me, like, what are some of the things about being evangelical that surprised you as an outsider? And it's relevant here is like the like learning that you are basically like nothing without Jesus, that you have to constantly strive to prove yourself as a worthy person.
Yeah.
And so I think messages like that are really hard to untangle. Like that damage is hard to untangle from purity culture damage because it's all so connected.
Yeah.
Just the sense that like you are gonna, can I say fuck up on your podcast?
Yeah.
But just like that, you're going to fuck this up, that you are, bad, unworthy, inherently sinful, and anything you do is going to be the wrong thing.
Yeah.
That is, I've seen it take root in people in a variety of ways. Some folks are deeply like paralyzed by the thought of even engaging with their own sexuality, let alone with a partner.
Yeah.
Other people even manifest physical discomfort and issues, such as if you are a person who's female assigned, you might experience pelvic floor pain and discomfort and vaginismus. But for a lot of people, there's just so much fear programmed at such an early age that decisions about sex are being made from a place of fear, not from a place of, I want joy, pleasure, and connection.
The connection that I make with that in the work that I'm doing now is in how a late diagnosed autistic ADHD neurodivergent individual such as myself, the process of discovering you've been masking for most of your life, rigid rule following in particular for those who are autistic, but trying to both unmask in that process, in particular as a late diagnosed person, understanding that core, that shame, that fear, that sort of like just so scared, and then those rules that kind of get baked in. With the way purity culture is set up, there's a lot of rigid rules. And being late diagnosed autistic, you tend to follow rigid rules, but we're also taught in that early evangelical way, fundamentalist way, you have to behave. You have to be so strict with these rules. You have to be ultimately the best behaved kid or else. All these different things that you mentioned, like God watching you, all these things. How do we start to work our way out of that to understand, in my perspective, how to unmask my way out of that, but in particularly coming out of the purity culture when kind of more attuned to that?
Oh, I mean, I know that's a scary thing to do, to be like, what if there aren't rigid rules about sexuality that I need to follow?
Yeah.
This is where I recommend thinking about what your own values are, because we need something to guide us. Like, for a lot of people, they'll say, I don't believe in the purity culture rules anymore and I don't follow them. I just want you to tell me, what are the new ways to be? What now do I follow? And I'm not going to tell anybody, because it's not my business what sexual values you choose for yourself. It's helpful in that situation to really sit down and think about, these are the purity culture rules or values that I was given, and what do I actually believe about them? And give yourself permission to question it. Like, now that you're questioning probably everything, because, purity culture deconstruction is usually part of a larger questioning of everything. So give yourself permission to question those rigid rules. Who do they benefit? Why were they created? Have they ever worked for you? What would happen if you don't follow them? What could be the best thing that could happen if you don't follow them? What could an uncomfortable outcome be if you don't follow them? How could you handle that uncomfortable outcome? Because I truly believe everyone, we have the ability to handle a difficult situation if it should arise. Yes, I would say, like, really give yourself permission to think about, what are the ways that I feel like I can live according to my values now?
Yeah. I want to kind of go back. You mentioned deconstructing, which you've got a great explanation of it in the book. I wonder if you could just sort of touch back in on that for people who may not know what the term deconstruction means, or deconstructing.
I don't know when the term kind of first hit the scene in relation to religious deconstruction, but it just means like taking apart the beliefs that you were given and beginning from the ground up. So beginning to dismantle a belief system that was given to you as the only belief system you were allowed to have, and then starting to question and recreate a belief system that works for you. And for some people, they deconstruct and then they're like, I'm done with this entirely, which respect. But other people are like, well, now that I have gutted my house down to the studs, it's like, what do I want to put back in it?
Yeah. And to that point, you've got a great section in the book about a lot of us who are doing that work in our, for me, it started in my late 30s, my early 30s, but folks who do that at many different decades of their life, there's this question that comes up as, is it too late for me? I feel very old to be doing this kind of work. What's your advice for people who are sort of stuck in that place of that feeling?
Yeah, I love when I get to address this, whether it's in an interview or with a one-on-one client. It is never too late to reach for what feels good and right to you. I have worked, one of my favorite clients at the moment is a couple I work with who are a married straight couple in their early 60s. And they were raised in like a very conservative, like Dutch Reformed church. And they are now, they raised all their kids. They did everything in a like conservative way. And they're now like, we would rather be having the best sex of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no, it is never too late to think about, what do I do moving forward? What do I actually want? I do believe that we get the impression that especially exploring sexuality is something that young people get to do.
Yeah.
We always think about it like, oh, those crazy 20 somethings, they're out there just, messing around and sleeping around. And then the common understanding is that you settle down after that.
Yeah.
And that if you've done a different process, you're just screwed. It's just too late because the 20s was when you were supposed to do all.
Yeah.
But that is so untrue. And I say that as somebody who works with a lot of divorced folks who are in middle age. And by middle age, I mean, I'm 46. I'm like, that's middle age, right? So people in their 40s, people older than their 40s who are doing exploration of their sexuality in ways that they never, ever would have dreamed of in their 20s or teens or even in their 30s. And I like to tell people, like, you're probably better equipped for it now than you were back then.
Yeah.
Because now you have a greater understanding of who you are, what you want. You probably have more resources. You probably have better relational skills. And so exploring sexuality, regardless of your age, it is something that you are absolutely allowed to do.
Well, and to that point, there's a lot of us that come out queer in the process of doing that. And there's so, like, I just watched Taylor Tomlinson's special last night.
Is that a new one?
Yes.
Okay, I've heard about
Prodigal
this.
Daughter. You need to. It's like,
I can't wait.
It's like she wrote this special just for you.
Oh, that's so good.
So I wanted to make sure I watched it before I talked to you because I was like, it's just the two things go so perfectly together.
Oh, that's awesome.
But Taylor, obviously this is not a spoiler because it's in the commercials for it, but Taylor came out queer in her 30s. I discovered my queer identity in my early 30s. And there just sort of seems to be this huge overlap between, all right, we've broken free of purity culture. Now we're finding our queer identity. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there is such a huge, like, oh my God, I came out so late.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to discover all of this. Now what? Kind of, like I feel like it just takes that to that next level of trying to work through that.
Yeah. And that's another area where I think we get the impression that there's a timeline that you should have been on, that you should have known when you were younger so that you could have your adolescence as a queer person. But for so many people who were raised in like a fundamentalist religion, I always say, like, it's not that you just didn't acknowledge your queerness. It would have never even occurred to you that that was potentially an option. So it's not just that the door was shut, it's that the door was shut and covered by like 10 bookcases and a bunch of other shit. Like, you couldn't get to the door.
No.
You didn't know it was there.
Yeah.
So,
it's like we had a blindfold on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely. But you still experience, the newness of understanding your queer identity. You're just doing it at a later age.
Yeah.
And a lot of people do describe it as a second adolescence. And I think that's a great way to look at it. Like you're going through a new period of self-discovery, and the amount of queer people whose story mirrors yours is, there's more people than I can even fathom.
Yeah.
And that's because we live in a homophobic society. So even if you weren't raised in a high control religion, like, it's still hard to come out unless you have a supportive family, community, live in a place that feels safe. And as we're seeing like increasing hostility towards queer and trans people every fucking day in this country, that's going to continue to be people's story, is that they're not going to be coming out at a young age. They're not going to be able to do it until they're in more control of their lives.
I was going to say, it feels like that this critical moment in our time, I feel like I'm watching a swing back, where more people are not, young people in particular, are not going to feel safe to come out, especially if they're trans or non-binary, or, it's just that fear is getting baked back in again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Why in particularly does waiting for marriage still have such a hold on us?
Oh, this reminds me. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the term compulsory heterosexuality. And for anyone unfamiliar with that term, it was coined by a lesbian poet in the 70s, Adrienne Rich, and she wrote an essay, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. And compulsory heterosexuality refers to her theory that we are all groomed from birth to be straight, and that the societal like frameworks and institutions push us into straight marriage. And at the time she was writing, like, women couldn't get their own credit cards and bank accounts because unless you had a man to do it for you. I think like being so focused on marriage is even besides like church values, it is such a assumption for everyone in Western society, like that you're going to get married.
Yeah.
That's what you're supposed to do. I mean, even queer people who are coming of age once marriage equality was legal, I think they think that that's like, well, this is just what you do. You're an adult and you get married. It is so baked into our society, and the government makes it so it's beneficial to you, and it's only increasing. Current policies are increasing that make it so being married gives you some financial advantage.
Well, and in some cases, healthcare advantages too. If you are an individual who can't get that insurance unless you're married.
Yep. That's how I have insurance as a self-employed person.
Yeah.
My hope is that this is a book you pass around.
Yeah.
This is a book you steal.
Yeah.
This is a book that you leave in a little free library. This is a book that you covertly put on Liberty University's campus. I want people to share it. And I'm so glad you asked the earlier question about, what if you feel like potentially very triggered by some of the information. It is a book where you get to pick and choose what you take. And none of this is like a mandate. Like nothing in this book is a mandate. And that's how I approach sex education, regardless of who I'm working with. It's like, here is the information that I know to the best of my and science's knowledge, and you get to decide how to apply it to your life.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want people who are hesitant to read the book to think, fuck, if I read this book, then I'm going to have to go out and have casual sex, or I'm going to have, start dismantling my beliefs about pornography. Like, you don't have to do any of that.
Yeah.
The book isn't going to push you. And I would like to think that it will reassure you that you get to be the boss of yourself in this area.
You gave me kind of a flashback from when I was in college. So by the time I got to college, I was free of the purity culture. I was in the process of like being in this weird place of like having the freedom of college, being on my own, not quite deconstructing yet, but still living with all those rigid rules, and being with a partner who very much was just like, what the fuck is this? Like, why are you so strange? Why will you not do A, B, or C? Why are you so rigid? Why, and at that time I was still convinced I had to wait for marriage and all that. So when I got to the section in the book about going through the process, being an older adult, having this conversation, how do we start having those conversations with new partners as we're kind of having that sexual debut, or we're kind of coming back through on this other side?
Yeah. I think that you get to decide how much you tell a partner about your background with purity culture. And I've worked with people who are like, well, I just wanted to have a sort of casual relationship, and I didn't tell them that I hadn't had much experience. That is completely your prerogative. But if you are planning on like building a relationship that has a lot of emotional intimacy and you want there to be safety, then consider sharing with them like, hey, this is a little bit more about my background, but I do emphasize that you don't have to apologize.
Yeah.
You don't have to say, I'm so sorry that I'm weird about sex, or I'm so sorry that I didn't have a first sexual encounter until, I was 35. Like, that's Anybody, that no one needs an apology for that.
Yeah.
It's just you are purely on a different timeline, and that's okay. So I always tell people, share that information if you feel like it's going to help you build a solid foundation of intimacy, but don't share it just because you think I'm weird and I need a warning label, that I need to like put a disclaimer on myself, because that's not true.
That's not going to help anybody.
No.
My thanks to Erica Smith for her time today. I really did enjoy our conversation, and I really enjoyed this book. Again, you can see all my sticky notes inside this book. It's a great book. It has a lot of explanations. It has a lot of helpful information. It also does a lot of myth busting and helps better understand fact from fiction. And I highly encourage that if this is an area that you're interested in and you're trying to unmask as well through your journey, I recommend Erica's book, which you can find through a link in the description below, and I hope you can check that out. You can also get more information about Erica Smith and the work that she does, also in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video has been helpful. If you'd like more information about the book, Erica, check out all the information below, and be sure to like and subscribe for my channel. It really does help the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll check out some of the other videos while you're here.